You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name is Ryan Evans. I'm the founder of War on the Rocks. In this episode, I was joined by General C.Q. Brown, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We spoke about his argument for how America can realize a true defense industrial enterprise. We also spoke towards the end of the episode about how his military career prematurely ended, how he thinks about that, and how he views his role going forward. Enjoy the show. Thanks so much for joining us, sir.
Well, Ryan, it's my pleasure. My pleasure.
Always great to see you. You recently have weighed in on some major defense industrial policy debates in War on the Rocks, and I know you've been giving a few remarks about this. What made you choose to focus on this after your retirement?
It was an area that I was focused on over a number of years. If you go back to when I wrote Accelerate, Change, or Lose, that's where I started the focus. And as I transitioned to the chairman, I was doing some work, particularly in this area. I would say a bit unfinished, but I thought it was important to at least put some thoughts together. And I've been talking over the past several months to a number of different people about some areas that I was thinking through, and I wanted to put it all on paper and contribute to the conversation and add to what's already being done.
What do you view as the sort of risk of not acting? And I guess just to frame what your argument is, if you think this is fair, is you point out that we have the playbook, that we sort of know what we need to do. It's not a mystery. What's lacking has been urgency in action. And even though things are starting to move forward, it hasn't been happening fast enough. Is that a fair?
It is. And I just say, I spent most of my career as in operational type assignments. And there's the aspect of building out a strategy, getting recommendations, but there's also the aspect of implementing and executing. And I just felt like, as you looked at the various commission reports, the various discussions, and you can even say that about the paper I just put together, is we've talked about all these things about what needs to happen, but then we don't commit. And part of this is we've got to pick some things to be able to commit, to show a sense of urgency, to be able to move forward, to get the capability the warfighter is going to need in the future.
Across administrations, we've seen this problem. What do you think have been the reasons that we just haven't moved forward more aggressively on this?
I don't feel that we feel the pressure of a potential crisis. We need to understand what's going on in the world, and the world is getting more complex, and we're going to have to think about how we prepare ourselves. We don't want to have to fight, but part of this is deterrence, and part of that deterrence is having not only the will, but also the capability. And in some areas, I don't know that we have all the capabilities that we're going to require or set up ourselves up to be postured ahead of a conflict.
In the opening vignette of your anecdote of your article, you talk about the counter-ISIS campaign and how you saw munition stocks running low. Was that sort of the big light bulb moment for you?
That was probably the big light bulb moment. And partly what I was seeing there was, we had the coalition, the willing. They had the will, but they didn't have the firepower to go with it. And so they would bring, their airplanes to come with us, and we were in the same boat. We were dropping a number of joint direct attack munitions to a point where we were starting to end up having to pull from other combatant commands. And I knew that wasn't going to last forever, or it was going to be some friction points. And so, for example, one of the things I started doing was directing some of the loadouts to include laser-guided munitions that you could use on a clear weather day versus using GPS-guided munitions. So we could actually look to maintain a stockpile of the JDAMs when we needed them versus using all those. And now we're stuck with using laser-guided bombs, and the weather's bad and you can't strike. So it was a way to actually think about it. And really, I saw the pressure of munitions, but I also started thinking about a bigger campaign beyond this. Having served the United States Central Command before that, when our focus was on Iran, I felt that after we defeat ISIS, Iran would come back into the forefront. At the same time, we were looking at other parts of the world as well.
You mentioned that we haven't had this sort of crisis or forcing function. You had a front row seat, not just front row seat, you were a main participant in all of this. Why do you think, the war in Ukraine, largest land war in Europe since World War II, why wasn't that enough of a crisis to spur us into more action? And there was some action. It seemed a lot of the munitions discussions focused on 155s, which is fine, and that's important. But obviously it's a broader set of issues. But it wasn't, for whatever reason, it just seems like it wasn't enough to spur us into more aggressive action.
I think it's helped start the conversation. And watching how Dr. LaPlante from Acquisition and Sustainment was working with industry to determine, not just for 155, but other capabilities as well, working through how much time, how much money was going to take to do these things. And that's not something you want to do in a crisis. What I'm really thinking through is how do you set yourself up so that before you get into a crisis, you're already have the plan laid out of how you would start the manufacturing, have the supply chains, and those kinds of things. And so it is a start. I also believe as they did the supplemental, that supplemental was going to help our defense industrial base to be able to, start to scale, not only to produce capability for Ukraine, but also to look at how it produces for us and our allies and our partners as well.
And you point out that obviously this isn't just any given administration, Congress, and industry. You argue it's the same sort of ecosystem that we have to analyze.
That's correct. And this is where the 4 commissions, the bipartisan commissions, have done that analysis, come up with nearly 200 recommendations. And the key part here is which ones do we pick and start to implement to break the inertia and gain some momentum. There's some positive things that are happening. The discussions in the Pentagon while I was there, discussions in the Pentagon right now. So there's some positive steps. But again, we need to put a little more pressure on ourselves to deliver.
So let's go through the main components of what you're arguing. First you focus on this idea of more flexibility in processes and contracts.
Well, true. And one of the areas is to look at more portfolio and less line item. And that allows the ability to move money more quickly to a portfolio of capabilities, as well as the aspect of decreasing the restrictions on the colors of money across research and development, procurement, and sustainment. And with that flexibility in portfolio and with some transparency and dialogue to build trust, it'll be important to make sure that we put money against the programs that are being successful versus programs that are having some difficulty. And, I'd highlight the Army has already started some of that conversation. I know there's continued conversations on this, but it's going to be something that I think will be important to deliver capability.
And I know you saw the same thing I did, which was the report on the memo on breaking defense about acquisitions that's going to be issued by the Secretary of Defense. And I believe he's giving a big speech on this a couple days after we're recording this. So today's Wednesday, and he'll be giving that speech on Friday.
Those are all positive signs of very similar to some of the things that I'm highlighting. The key part now is, the implementation plan that goes with it. And the article also talks about there's some implementation plans behind it. I haven't seen the memo naturally, but I'll be curious once it comes out and how you not only take the idea, but how do you actually implement it and start get going on delivering capability.
To me, it sounds like you're asking Congress to give up a little bit of control. Is that fair, or do you think that that's the wrong way of thinking about it?
For Congress, it's not so much giving up control because they do have their oversight responsibilities. But by the same token, does the oversight have to be so tight? And to be able to provide a little bit more flexibility, but in order to do that, that's where I think the transparency and the communication needs to go back and forth between the Pentagon and Congress on various programs so that they feel like they can let go a little bit.
Or find new ways of doing the oversight.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, we have technology with dashboards and the like to be able to share information. And we've got to be able to do that, I think, more quickly internal to the Pentagon, but also with Congress as well. So you can think about how can you go a bit faster in certain areas and be able to move money and report to Congress. And they can stop you before you go too far in certain areas. But it has to be a dialogue to be able to do this. And it can't be done by the way we're kind of doing now, by very stovepipe, siloed budget line items. And, you can do something in one area that has an impact in someplace else. And it takes you a while to figure that out. And being able to have a bit more flexibility across and with greater dialogue, I think will definitely be important.
You also talk about this idea of consistency. What do you mean by that, and why has it been missing?
Well, I've worked in programming when I was a lieutenant colonel, 06 Select.
Not the most fun job, I guess.
Wasn't
not as fun as flying.
Actually, it was, from a career development standpoint, I knew that was something that was going to be important if I was going to stay around in the Air Force.
Yeah.
And it helped as I came to be a senior officer and definitely as a chief of staff of the Air Force. And so, what you would see is the numbers of name a weapon system changes every year. And it's because of whatever reason, we can use F-35, you can use different munitions, and the number goes up and down. And so I've had a chance to go visit in industry to aircraft factories, shipyards, munitions plants, and talking to retired senior officers that are working in industry now, and now they see it from the other side. And the aspect of it makes it difficult to build out your supply chains, build out your workforce, understand how much facilities you're going to need. If one year it's up to, it's higher and then it drops the next year, it's a bit of a roller coaster ride. And so because of that lack of consistency, then it makes it more challenging for them to kind of plan out. And they're not going to be, necessarily want to step out on a limb to go do something if they know or have a feel that next year this is going to be cut by half. And we just made a huge investment to bring together our workforce and supply chain and facilities. And so those are the kinds of things why I think the consistency is important and why I push for multi-year procurement in some of my testimony and my engagements with the Hill.
And this is where I think it's important to talk about how you make these assessments of what we need and when. And so you obviously looking at the operational plans, the O plans, especially as chairman, how did you make these judgments about what we needed when? And I know there was some work done in the Biden administration on a new readiness framework to help inform these decisions.
Yeah, the readiness framework was actually, how do we preserve the capability we have? So that was one part. And what I was really trying to do there as a chairman was, as we had different crises around the world, was to ensure we didn't, at least as I provided options, to understand what the risk was, to having opportunity cost to be able to do something else. And so that was the area that I was focused on. Not only as we OSD did the Office of Secretary of Defense did their readiness framework, it was also the engagements I was doing with the combatant commanders and the Joint Chiefs in our strategic seminar series, where we do more of a tabletop exercise and run scenarios to really talk about what's the impact of readiness based on the decisions we have today, how it will impact tomorrow. The other area I was looking at was the aspect of, as we engage with industry, how well does industry understand what our priorities are? What I mean by that, each service will talk to, a company, one of the primes, and they'll have a perspective. Different commands within the service will talk to those industry partners, and they'll have a perspective. And then OSD's talking to them as well. And so, how do they figure out what is the priority for the department, other than waiting for the budget to come over with the resource, and it helps dictate some of that. Part of this is how do we as a department, and I did this in the Air Force, how do we actually take a look at what is it that is important for the Air Force, not for different parts of the Air Force, but for the Air Force at large. I felt the same thing, for the Joint Force. And one of the areas that I was working with J4 team and our director of logistics and our J8 team doing some of the analysis was, as you looked at the O plans, what are the most likely weapons that we're going to need across all the O plans? And we identified, if I recall correctly, it was like 11 that we knew about that would already existed in 2 emerging munitions. We did some analysis then, not only on the munitions, but then we also started to take a look at the supply chain associated with it, so we could actually figure out where are some of the bottlenecks that you have this one vendor or sub-vendor who's responsible for a number of these. And if you try to search all those at the same time, you're going to have a challenge. And so what we're really trying to do is identify, some level of priority, and then figure out then associate with that, the supply chain associated with it, so we can communicate that back to industry to go, these are the things that are important that we know about, and then at the same time help that inform decisions in the building from a resourcing standpoint. So it was a way to kind of get us all on the same page to start moving in a direction on some key components that we knew we were going to need.
How often did you bring together the combatant commanders and everyone else physically? Was that an annual exercise, or is that?
That was biannual. So we did that twice a year. And what I was doing associated with that, in the 6 months before each of the in-person meetings, I would do 2 tanks on these topics to build towards the tabletop exercise. And the tabletop exercise, we'd also bring in parts of the interagency to be to sit in. And
can you say, without obviously betraying anything sensitive, but which I know you wouldn't do, but what kind of tabletop, what did it look like? Were we looking at a scenario in a certain part of the world? How rigorous was the game design, or was it more of a sort of bog set kind of a thing?
Yeah, it wasn't as rigorous as probably, you're doing some of the real deep war games and tabletop exercises, but it wasn't a box out either. What we tried to do was not just pick a part of the world. We actually kind of replicated some of the things that were going on in real time, that we had different things that are happening around the world where, as chairman, Ukraine was already going on. The Middle East and, Hamas coming into Israel had already started. So you had that going on. We were focused on the Indo-Pacific as well. And so how do you take a look at across all those and forecast into the future a little bit, and then build a scenario based on the way the world is today, where we talk about it in our national security, national defense strategies, and then from that, then look at the capacity we have today and what we might have to use in the future, and how do you balance that so you don't burn everything today from a readiness standpoint, and then at a later date you go, God, I wish we had done something differently. And so part of this was trying to help inform how and why you would deploy now versus saving for later.
And what we do and don't give to Ukraine, things like that, I imagine.
Exactly. Ukraine, what forces we deploy around the world, how we preserve readiness for the services, because the services are generating readiness for the combatant commands to use. But there's a point where you can burn more readiness than you have capability, and you're going to have a deficit at a later date. I think the other part I was also looking at was as the services are going through various modernization pieces, and my time as the Air Force chief and fighter aviation was one of those, particularly as not that the Air Force is transitioning from F-16s, F-15s to F-35. The Marine Corps was doing the same thing. The Navy is doing the same thing. And so if we're all doing this at the same time, how well do we understand the aspect of how much capacity we're going to have if we don't talk to each other to figure out that, hey, we're all in a state of transition at the same time, and should we all do it at the same tempo and pace, and are we going to create a bathtub of capability for ourselves, unbeknownst, because we're not looking at the analysis associated with this to be able to say, if you do this in your budget, and we're doing this in our budget, then it's going to have an impact across the joint force.
You also talk about simplifying purchasing processes, and you mentioned the rewrite that's going on of the Federal Acquisition Regulation. And it seems like there's a lot of good momentum also from Congress with the Speed and Forged Acts and the new NDAA. I encourage people to read your argument about that, but I'd like to get your perspective on where the non-traditionals do and don't fit in. Obviously this new generation of defense companies are important. I would say most of your article is probably an argument focused on what we get from the traditional defense industry, but where do you see the role of non-traditionals? And just to say something provocative, Bill LaPlante sort of infamously said about Ukraine that these new companies are not doing anything important in Ukraine. Maybe that was an overstatement or unfair. I'm not asking you to.
Yeah, well, I mean, they do play a role. And you think about the aspect of research and development and innovation, most of that does not happen inside the Pentagon or inside the Department of Defense. It's happening outside of the Department of Defense these days. And this is where the non-traditionals have a role. I was just talking to somebody here about this recently. When you think about the non-traditionals, and we often talk about the Valley of Death, who's responsible for building the bridge across the valley? And I think it's really the department in Congress to do that, not the non-traditionals, because you want them actually doing non-traditional stuff to give us capability more quickly and not focus on how they're going to get across the Valley of Death. What door are they going to knock on to get started? We got to make that easier for them. And the other part of this, because when you look at innovation, going back to the aspect of line items, you don't know exactly what's going to turn out to be. And so you can't give a line item for something that doesn't exist yet. This is why the flexibility part that I talked about earlier is important. So you can go, we're going to set aside money to be able to support a technology, something that gets innovated that we haven't even thought about yet. And the challenge here is when we do our budgets, typically, if you don't have it tied to something, that's at risk of being scarfed up to go be put someplace else versus, you don't want to have necessarily a slush fund, but you want to have money set aside to be able to move very quickly. And there's been some work from Congress, some work from the Pentagon as well on these areas. But we've got to be, again, a little bit more flexible on some of this. And sometimes some of these things aren't going to work. We got to be okay with that. That's where innovation, you fail in innovation. And so
that's a real important point. I think that we need to message to people that it's okay to fail. That it's okay if things don't work out, and to message that especially to the civil service and uniform working on programs.
I guess there's got to be a limit to how much failure you're going to do before you go, hey, okay, we're going to have to move on to something else. But that's why the dialogue has to go back and forth on, even if it's failing, is it probably the best bet to get to where you're going to go versus something else that is, tried and true that works, but it's behind where the threat's going. And so you still can put money in something so you sustain something that's going to be irrelevant anyway, versus investing in something that's going to give you capability in a future date, as you continue to learn. So it's a cultural shift.
And that's really at the heart of this. And this is something you have a lot of experience with, from Accelerate, Change, or Lose or onward, is a lot of your tenure as a leader has been about trying to change the culture of organizations, small and large. What, looking back on how that went, what do you wish you thought about more when you were sort of putting pen to paper on Accelerate, Change, or Lose when it comes to changing culture?
Maybe I was a little bit naive on the bureaucracy part. I thought there's some things I could have done and some changes we were trying to do to change part of our internal process to move faster, cut down some of the overhead. Ideally, what I was hoping that we could take some of the bodies out of the Pentagon and put it back out in the field. Because when I traveled around, as the commander of Pacific Air Forces, promoted commander and the like, I get feedback, hey, we're only X% manned. We'd like to have more people. And, what I would tell the force is, well, I don't walk around with bags of money and bags of service members. So what could I do to help you effectively have more money and more service members? And part of that was crushing some of the bureaucracy, some of the things that were not, adding time but not adding value. And that was the area where I didn't get as far as I'd hope. And what I was really trying to do is, when you look at change makes people uncomfortable. I'd rather be a little bit uncomfortable now versus a lot uncomfortable later because we didn't change. And that was part of my focus. And I didn't get as far as I'd hoped, but I do think it still had an impact.
Mm-hmm. So back to this draft memo that was leaked to Breaking Defense that Secretary Hegseth is reportedly going to be coming out with and delivering this speech about. It sounds like, based on what we can read from what's in the memo, that there's a lot of really positive stuff from training and, new policies and new expectations and commercial first. I mean, first, before I get to some other issues about that, are you as encouraged by this as I am?
It's a good sign, just based on, of course, not having seen the memo, but only reading an article about the memo. It's got some positive things in there. But so did, all the commissions all had positive things in there. The key part now is being able to see the action associated with the positive things that are laid out. And the area is, the article reported, the secretary is, putting the memo out. It's going to talk to industry CEOs. That's good, but you also got to have members of Congress and their staffers in there because they also play a role. And, my article, I do talk about all three entities have to play a role and collaborate to have all these things come together. And, being able to engage with Congress will be important on this as well.
I mean, it seems like there is a lot of common thought from Congress on this too, but as you just said, it's all about implementation. And so what I've seen from this administration is some really good policies. So, for example, the other transactions memo that Secretary Hegseth issued, like, great stuff. We can name some other things, but getting people to actually do these things is a totally different game. And so, for example, if you have contracting officers and people who oversee contracting officers who still think you can't buy software unless it's FedRAMPed, which is not true. If you still, if you have a workforce that's not educated, incentivized, being told that it's okay to fail, how will this implementation actually unfold?
It's got to be more than just, telling people it's okay to do certain things. If it really
or that they should do certain things.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think in order to change the culture, you need to have some of the right incentives. My paper talks about that briefly, where it's performance-based, career advancement, financial incentives, program incentives. We've got to think about how we incentivize the behaviors that we want. If you want to change the culture of our contracting officers and the acquisition process, do we have the right incentives? Because if we don't change the incentives, they will continue to do the way that we've been doing things because they don't feel comfortable. And then the other part of this is, how do you highlight those that are getting it right? How do you give them more visibility and show them as an example of this, was what right looks like, to be able to move at speed and scale to bring capability, and then, allow others to model themselves after this. And I realize you probably can't do this, holistically across everything we're doing, but I think there are certain areas where you can pick and really try to focus on and really bring in the right people with the right mindset, right attitude in this initial cadre as you're trying to drive this change.
To shift gears a little bit, your career was, prematurely ended by the President and Secretary of Defense. Some people might be listening to this podcast and wondering why we're not talking about that, why you're talking about defense industrial issues. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on how your career ended and how you think about your role going forward.
Right after the election, my name was in the press about potentially being fired. And it just so happened we were at a joint staff offsite. I knew the staff was a little bit worried. And I told them then, do not worry about me. We have a job to do, make the main thing the main thing. Our job is to defend the nation. And so that kind of died off a bit. And then, my last week in the job, rumors started coming around again. I was also concerned about just the force at large, because we had a number of people that were going through the same thing about where their career is going to go, but their name wasn't in the press. They weren't towards the end of their career. They were still mid-career. My last day as a chairman, I was on the border. I did my morning update with the joint staff. And so I told them the same thing I told them back in November, is don't worry about me. Make the main thing the main thing. We still got a job to do. And once I got the call, I was okay with the aspect of the things that I had done throughout my career. I had zero regrets. Naturally, I don't think I would have changed anything about my career. But I really, the reason why I wrote this piece is I still care deeply about our national security. And I still have, friends that are still serving, friends that are in Congress that I've had a chance to get to know, friends that I know in the industry. And I don't think just because I'm out of the job as a chairman doesn't mean I don't care about some of the same things. And so I want to be able to contribute to our national security. I want to continue to serve. I'm just going to be, doing it in a little bit different way. I still care deeply about our nation, our national security, our service members and their families.
What have you been doing since you retired?
A little bit of a portfolio of things. Well, the first thing I do is my wife says I'm going from 200 miles an hour to 180. So I've slowed down a little bit. And I tell people kind of jokingly that I do nothing before 9 o'clock except work out and have coffee by the pool.
Big change.
It is a big change. But then what I've been doing, one of the first things I did, I'm at Duke University as an executive in residence with a joint appointment in the public policy school and the engineering school because my degree's in engineering. But I've also spent a lot of time in public policy and national security space. So, I get to do several times a month to guest lecture. I'll co-teach a course in the spring. I'm on with one of our consulting companies as a senior advisor. I'm on one board doing some public speaking, advising some smaller companies that are in the defense tech space because they were going to bring some capability. I want to be able to help them think through how they get across the valley, but also the capabilities that they're producing. How does it not only support our national defense, but how does it support us economically in some areas? How do they take what the technology they're using and apply it to military or defense applications? So doing that. And then naturally spending more time with family. And so that's been a positive as well.
What would you say to service members who, they're keeping the main thing as the main thing, but they also see a lot of churn at the top, and there's a lot of the military being dragged into politics, a lot of general officers and flag officers being relieved early and told to retire. What would you say to them as they sort of watch all this stuff happening at the top and they might not be sure how to think about it?
Well, it goes back to what I said earlier. You need to continue to stay focused on our primary job is to defend our nation and also prepare for warfighting. If you go back to the memo I wrote as my first day in the office as chairman, one of my first expectations, honing a warfighting skill has primacy in all we do. They still got to do that. It's not that we're looking to go to conflict, but we want to make sure that our adversaries wake up every day and say, not today, because they see the strength of the United States and our military. And so I think it's important that they continue to stay focused on that. No one said serving in the military is going to be easy. Life is not fair, but it's important. And anything that's worth doing is going to take a little bit of effort. And this is important to our nation. And I'm very proud of all of our service members, past, present, and future. I was at an event last night and had a chance to spend time with some VMI cadets. And just this weekend, my wife and I were at dinner. We met a young man from the University of South Florida who is going to commission into the Space Force here in May. And so I think it's important that I and others still play a role in our national defense. And I'm really proud of those that are still in uniform and the work that they're doing.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the War on the Rocks podcast. Do not miss our membership program at moreontherocks.com/membership. We also have a great podcast called Cogs of War, which focuses on defense tech and industrial issues. It's a free podcast, free for everyone. Subscribe to it on your podcast app of choice. Stay safe and stay healthy.